Hello, Blake Root is here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and today I want to talk about Topaz Clarity, and more importantly I want to touch on some things that I talked about in a recent webinar with Topaz Labs, and that's about contrast control and how you can really make a photograph so much better with contrast. And one of the things that Clarity does is it offers the ability to manipulate contrast in ways that we can't really do very easily in Photoshop without jumping through a lot of hoops. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And if I show you the before and after here, so this is the before picture. This is not an HDR image, okay? This is one of the first here. Don't always do this, but what I'm going to be doing is turning this exposed photo. It's not too dark, it's not too light, it's got a good zero exposure value for this photo, and I'm going to be turning it into something like this. It's got a more artistic feel to it, maybe a little bit more painterly, but this was all done with Topaz Clarity and this idea behind contrast control. So let's go ahead and look at our basic photo. So one of the things that I did at the Topaz webinar was I gave away an actions pack, and if you go into the description here on the YouTube channel, in the description, you'll see the action package there. If you're on the website now watching this, you'll see it just below this video. You can download this actions package. And the first thing I'm going to do is run this thing called Contrast Checker. If you did see the Digital Photography School article I did recently, it's the same contrast checker. Now I'm going to press play on this contrast checker. And what this contrast checker is going to do is initially it's going to just make my photograph a gradient map. So it's taking all of the tonal values in my photo and mapping them out on a gradient map so that my darkest areas now become dark on that gradient map and the lightest areas become light. But one thing that you'll notice here is that there's not a whole lot of pure black and there's not a whole lot of pure white, and the contrast in between kind of has this muddy feel to it. The whole photo has a muddy feel to it. It's kind of bland, it's kind of blah, and it just feels a little bit muddy. And the reason why is because of contrast. So let's look at our curves adjustment layer here. Now, if we look at our curves adjustment layer, you can see that on the right side of our curve, we have quite a bit of white that is non-existent. So in the whole clippings idea, this is what we're doing here. We're clipping. We're telling Photoshop that we don't want white to start here. We want white to start here. And the way to see that, to see what's happening to your white, is by pressing Alt or Option as you click on that and moving it to the left. You can see where the areas start to clip in your photo. Now, I like to clip just until areas of detail, like you see that little line at the bottom of the photo down here, until areas of detail start to get a little bit of white clipping in it. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, until areas of detail start to get a little bit of shadow, a little bit darker. Then we'll take that gradient map off and see a difference. So here's our difference already. That was already quite the difference in our photograph to make that photo better. But I'm telling you, with Topaz Clarity, we're going to make it even better. So before I open Topaz Clarity, the first thing I want to do is duplicate my background. I'm going to go ahead and leave this contrast checker open because we're going to be using it at the end. But I'm going to press Command or Control J on my background to duplicate it. I always start with a duplicate before I go into any of my Topaz products. And the reason why is just that I don't want to do anything destructive. I don't want to do anything to the background that would be considered destructive. And I want to have that background as a base layer in case I need anything from it before I go into the other programs. So I'm going to click on that background, copy, go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Topaz Clarity. So let's reset everything so that we don't see what we did here. And really what I want to show you here is a trick that I use to get the right look in my photographs. And I'm not going to say I do this every single time, because if I did it might be redundant. But once you get good at it, you don't need to really do this anymore. But it gives you a good idea of what you're looking for when you're modifying the contrast in your photo. So in Topaz Clarity, if you've never seen it before, there are some presets on the left. I typically don't use many presets, but over here on the right, this is your main panel. This is where you get to do a lot of editing. And if you've ever used any other Topaz products, you'll notice it. There's usually a lot more settings. There's a lot more stuff that you can do with those photographs in those other programs when you click over here on the right-hand side of the panel. And in Clarity, all you have is clarity and hue, saturation, luminance. So at first glance, you're thinking, I got gypped. But after you watch this, you're going to see even more reasons why you need clarity. And if you already have clarity, you're going to see even more reasons why to use clarity. So the trick that I do here, just like the contrast checker, I'm going to go into the hue, saturation, luminance, and I'm going to go to saturation and drop that saturation all the way out. So it's -1. That's kind of the same thing that we get from the contrast checker. And there's a reason why I do this. Let's look at the histogram. So if we look at the histogram right now, before, this is with the saturation dropped, all we're looking at is tone. Here's your black areas, here's your white areas. Now you can see our white areas don't start till about almost, I guess, about 3/4 of a way into the photograph. So that's white area that's non-existent, that we're losing out on almost completely. Now let's look at this in color. In color, that histogram is a lot more confusing. You've got your blue channel, your red channel, your yellow channel, your green channel, where those channels match up to make different colors with your cyans and it just becomes a mess. That's why when you look at that histogram with the saturation all the way down, you're now only looking at tone, and you're seeing where those tones are not or where they are. So if we look at this in color though, we can see that our blue channel rests very strongly in our lights. But let's just drop that all the way down, make it -1, and see what we can do with this photograph to make it look better. So just click and drop it. If you drag it down, sometimes the saturation doesn't go all the way down. If you just click all the way down, and then it'll go down. So now let's look at our clarity, and let's look at the micro contrast first. So in the micro contrast, these are going to be your very small contrasty areas. I'm going to move this up pretty high. Now, look what happened to the histogram as I did that. I moved that micro contrast all the way up, and we started to see where our whites were and how they've now are resting on that right-hand side of the area. Basically what we did with the contrast checker, we clipped those areas. So we did some clipping in those micro contrast areas to make this a more powerful photograph. So if we go back to where we were before at 0, you can see that we don't have that depth. Depth is the key thing here. When you move, when you make things lighter or darker, you're creating more depth in your photograph. This is a muddy photograph right now. It's muddy. It's a muddy gray. It needs some work. So I'm going to move that back over to about the 0.8 range, and that works for me. Now I'm doing this in black and white, and during the webinar I didn't show the histogram. It wasn't something that I left out intentionally. It was just something that I assumed that people know, and you should never assume that people know. I usually try to train to the lowest common denominator, so that's why I'm doing the histogram now, so you can see as I make these contrast adjustments what's happening to our histogram as we do it. So if I move the low contrast up, which I like the look of moving the low contrast up, I like the overall look of what I get by making it less muddy, but look what I'm doing here. I'm doing some clipping. So let's look at the medium contrast and see what happens when we drop that. So when we drop the medium contrast a little bit, we start to gain some of that clipping back on those shadow areas on the left. Let's do the same thing with the, let's move that down just a little bit more, with the high contrast. So same thing here. I'm kind of squeezing in that histogram a little bit on the highlights and the dark side when I move that high contrast down. So I like where we are now with this photograph. I like where we've come from and what we've done with this histogram. But let's look at the tone level now. So if we look at our histogram and we move the black level down, look what happens. See how that clipping occurs on the histogram. Now we're just paying attention to the histogram. So by looking at the histogram, we're saying, okay, there's a lot of black in this photograph. Now let's look at the photo. There's a lot of black in this photograph. That's not the direction we want to go with that. So let's move that up just a little bit and see what happens. You see how we start to narrow out that curve a little bit, so just barely a little bit touches. That's where, like we talked about with the contrast checker before, how we just started to bring out some detail area that had some white involved in it. And that's exactly where we want to be with that black level. So now let's look at the whites. Same thing here. If we just move it up just a little bit, we can see how we start to clip in those highlights. Now that's maybe a little too much clipping in those white levels, so let's move that down a little bit. So then it looks good at about 0.5. Our histogram looks good, the photo looks good, I think that looks great. So now let's go back to color here and look at what we've got. So here's our before, here's our after. We brought out a lot of details in this photograph, but we can take it even farther because now we're going to look at the color aspect of this. So what I'm going to do here is just drop the overall saturation down again and just look at the luminance values. Because what luminance values are, the luminance values in a color of a photograph are how white and how dark that color is. So when I look at the luminance values of, say, red in this photograph or orange in this photograph, let's look at orange in particular. If I move orange up, you can see all these areas down here start to get white. Now let's look at that in color real quick. This is something that until I started playing with the digital zones or the color zone system, I didn't realize how much of colors are in certain areas. I didn't realize that this area down here would be orange. To me, I guess I didn't really know what color that would be. If I really started to dissect it a little bit, I guess I could figure out that it was orange. But if we move that luminosity up in the orange, we can see that we're now making that area in the foreground a little bit lighter. If we move it down, now we can start to see where those orange areas are being affected in the dark areas. Now, I don't like moving it down in that direction. I like it more in the up direction. But in color, it's difficult to see what we're going to be doing with that. So if we take the saturation and drop that down, and now look at the luminance value of our orange, we can see how it affects just the tone of the overall image. And before, when we did it in color, we were struck by what's happening down here, but actually there's a lot going on up in these buildings up here. We move the luminosity of the orange up as well. So I just wanted to show you that on the luminance level. Let's go back to saturation, move that up to 0, and now we'll manipulate the color in this photograph. We don't want that for sure. So I'm going to look at the luminance values first. So if I move the orange up, I can see what that's affecting in those areas down below, and I like that. I like the foreground to be lighter than that background area, especially in this photograph. And not the case in every photo, but in this photo definitely, because it helps the viewer walk into this photo. So then if I look at red, I can look at the luminance value of red. If you take it too far, you can definitely see this happening right there on the sign back there in the background. And that's way too far. You don't want to take it that far. You don't want to take it to the point that detail starts to get blown out with the sacrifice of making a color lighter or darker. So let's make sure we didn't do that with our foreground ground area by blowing this up. Making it lighter or darker. See, if you do it darker, you start to get tone compression in those areas, and we don't want that. So we're just going to move that up just a little bit, just about there. That's good. So now let's look at yellow. And yellow is going to be these trees. Yellow controls a lot in the color and the foliage of things. So if we move the yellow up, it starts to get lighter. If we move it down, it starts to get darker. But when we move it down, it starts to bring out some detail area in that tree. So I like that. I like the detail that that's bringing out. Now let's look at green. Green is typically going to be just an accent color for those yellows. So I'm actually going to move that up a little bit to just hit the accent on those leaves and the foliage there to kind of give it a separation between the lights and the darks of that yellow in particular. If we take the HSL filter off, you can see that we're making those a little bit more detailed in a sense by moving the luminance values up and down. And now let's zoom out a little bit. Let's get this back to where it was and look at aqua. So aqua is going to be a lot of what's happening in the reflection on these windows, and I don't like those reflections to be dark. I want those to be light. So I'm going to bring that all the way up, or pretty far up. And then let's look at blue. So blue is going to be a lot of background in our sky. So the luminance value on blue, we can start to bring some of that value out in that blue. And when we do that though, we're just kind of making that blue area darker. But what we can also do, now that we've gotten all these settings right, is start looking at the saturation of these colors. And the saturation, we've talked about luminance. Luminance is adding light and dark to the color. The saturation is how much of that color is present within the area that you're affecting. Hue, let's talk about that real quick. Hue is just changing the actual color profile of the color you're working on the color wheel. So if you look here, if we were to take red and move it over, all the way over, we've now taken everything that is red in this photograph and turned it orange, or what looks like maybe a 30-degree turn on the color wheel. We've taken, basically just rotated the color wheel just for the specific color of red. Now it only lets you go so far. Photoshop allows you to go all the way around the color wheel, at least 180 degrees in either direction when you move it back and forth. But things like Camera Raw only allow you to do the maybe 30-degree turn, just like it is here in Topaz Clarity. And minimize this real quick so we're just seeing our HSL panel. Alright, so let's go back into saturation because that's where we stopped off on. I'm actually going to boost up the saturation in the reds because I like what happens when I boost the saturation in the reds. I'm not going to go all the way up here because that's way too much red. It starts to present what's called color bleeding, where those colors are starting to bleed out into the rest of the area. So I'm not going to bring it up that high. I might bring it up to about here. Now the thing is, you don't need to bring it all the way up. But here's what I also know. This is in Kansas City. It's a Union Station here in Kansas City. I know that that Union Station sign is a pretty deep red. It looks good. This is not a very deep red. It's a muddy gray red, and that's kind of our focal point here. So I'm going to accent that by bringing it up. That doesn't mean that we should go all the way up here with our saturation on any of these colors, because this doesn't make, in my opinion, coming from my artistic background and my HDR background, I don't really like super saturated colors to the point that they are not accenting the image. Now, if you're just saturating for the sake of saturating, I say avoid it. If you're saturating because you're trying to emphasize a color, then it's not necessarily a problem, as long as you don't oversaturate it so much that someone says, hey, he jacked up that saturation slider. You don't want that to happen. You're just doing a subtle saturation increase. Let's look at the saturation of the orange. So if I bring the saturation up, we're going to add more color to that orange. But actually, I'm going to move the saturation down in that one and take some of the color out of those areas so that the other colors aren't competing with it. Because if we bring this all the way up, orange has a lot going on in this photo. And I don't want the red competing with that orange. I don't want the blue to be competing with that orange. So I'm going to bring the orange down a little bit. And then I'm going to go into yellow and look at yellow and the saturation. Now if I bring the yellow up so much, it doesn't look that great, so I'm going to bring it up just a little bit. Let's look at green and see. There's not a whole lot of green in here, but we can see that the green is affecting these windows up here. So I'm actually going to bring that down so that those don't get affected so much. Aqua, again, that's going to be in those windows up there. Bring that down just a little bit. And here's where we're going to take the blue and give it just a little bit more definition. You see that? I accented the blue with more saturation. I didn't bring the saturation all the way up here. That's a no-no. It doesn't look good. At first glance, if you're doing this for the first time, go ahead and do it. Save it in a spot just for the sake of getting it out. And just, I super saturated a photo. Man, it feels good. And then save it somewhere and hide it, and only revisit it when you're lonely. No, I'm just kidding. If you like super saturation, go right ahead and do it. Some people do like it. I don't. I like to saturate my colors to an extent that it adds to the overall value of the photograph without overarching the photograph. If you want to add to the overall value, go ahead, but don't trump the color in your photograph by super saturating 1, 2, or 3 colors. So purple and magenta, I don't usually mess with those because there's not a whole lot of purple or magenta in the photos. Let's go to hue. So in the hue, if we look at the hue of, say, red, if we move that over to the right, we're going to make it more orange. If we move it to the left, we're going to make it more magenta. I don't think red really needs a change. I like it as red. Let's look at the orange and see what happens if we add a little bit more towards the yellow-green direction. And by all means, when you're making these adjustments, move it all the way to the left and all the way to the right to see what it is that you want, because we're basically going to be doing temperature control right now. I'm adding a temperature to this orange. Essentially, I'm making it either warmer or cooler. So I'm going to just add a little bit on the cooler side, make it more towards the green, rotating around towards the cooler blues. Now let's look at the yellow. Now the yellow, that yellow isn't very yellow. It's kind of a dull, drab yellow. Now we know that as we look at things in nature, they do have a good, nice green color to it. The leaves on my tree outside are very green. They aren't this dull, drab yellow. They're pretty green. Now that doesn't mean that they need to be this green, or let's change it to fall. Oh look, it's fall now. That's actually not a bad technique to change the color in there, but you have to understand it's going to do it to the grass too. If we move it over just a little bit, just to add a tint of green in there. I'm not trying to make it a surreal dreamscape here. If you're going for a dreamscape, by all means, do what you will. But I'm just increasing just a little bit of yellow in there, just a little bit of green in that yellow to introduce some more green to those trees. Now let's do the same thing with green. And green is typically just going to be an accent. Now let's look at aqua and see if we need to change that. If we drop the saturation in a color like green, and then we modify the hue of green, you're not going to see a whole lot of effect because we aren't working with a whole lot of green to begin with. So now let's look at blue. And with blue, we don't want to make it this super cyan because, again, it's not a realistic sense. So I'm just going to move this over just a little bit, just so that it adds a little bit more of that deeper, kind of more towards the magenta side, actually, because this was midday. It wasn't morning. The blue was around for a while. So I'm going to go right about there. So let's look at our before and after with color. So here's our before and after with clarity and tone, with what we did with all the clarity and the tone. So that looks good now with the clarity and the tone, and now here we have it with the color. We've manipulated the color. I think we're at a very good jumping point to go into Photoshop. So we'll press OK, and we'll bring this right back into Photoshop and look at it with the contrast checker and see if there's anything else we need to do to this photograph to make it better. Okay, so I'm just going to rename this background layer. I'm going to call it CLAR for clarity. And now we're going to look at the contrast checker. So let's look at our gradient map over top of this photograph. And now let's take the eyeball off of our new clarity adjustment and see what we did to this photograph. We really bumped up the clarity in this, almost made this look like an HDR photograph when it was really just a normal photograph to begin with. And that's how powerful clarity can be, just with those contrast controls. When you start to get into those really nitpicky contrast areas, that's basically what you're doing with tone mapping, is you're mapping those contrast areas to extract certain areas that you want, typically layered with multiple photographs. But in this case, we're just using what's already there in this raw file that we have and exploiting that to make an HDR photograph. Would you call this a pseudo HDR? I don't think so. I would just call it an HDR photograph because we're increasing the dynamic range. We're increasing that range of white to black. And that's basically what dynamic range is. It's the contrast between the two colors, and in those micro details you get those really awesome HDR looking photos. So now let's look at the initial curve that we put on here from the very beginning and see if all this starts to come together. So here's the initial curve that we did for our contrast checker to make this, the original photograph, better. Now we're applying all that to our clarity photo, and let's take the gradient map off to see if that actually does add value to it. And I think it does. It might be a little too white because we already did a lot of white clipping in our Topaz Clarity. So if we drop the white clipping here just a little bit, let's look at this. Now, here's the deal. When you press and you hold Alt on the clippings here, you see that we now have blue and all these other different colors in there. Those are areas that clipping is occurring in those color channels. That's why I like to do this on a black and white, so that when you press Alt or Option, all you're seeing are the tones. So let's drop this down until we just get a little bit of that detail area, like I said before, in those lines at the bottom. And now we've just amplified that just a little bit more. So one of the other things that you're going to see in this action is a dodge and burn layer, and I'm going to dodge and burn. So now I'm just going to press play on dodge and burn, and it's going to open up and say you're now set for non-destructive dodging and burning, which is the best dodging and burning in the world because we aren't affecting anything in any bad way. All we're doing is it on its own layer. So when you press play on this, it's automatically going to set you up with the dodge tool. So I've got the dodge tool selected now, and there are some areas that I want to dodge out here. It seems a little dark around this Union Station sign, so I'm just going to, clicking on this layer, it's a 50% gray layer, I'm just going to go ahead and start dodging that Union Station sign to start bringing out some life to that, to make it a little bit lighter, so that as it becomes lighter, the focal point starts to come out more. People start to see that Union Station a little bit better. So if we just click that on and off, you see how that added a little bit of increase, a little bit more around this T here. And I'm dodging and dodging and dodging. Now if you want to burn, you can switch to the burn tool on the fly by pressing and holding Alt or Option. So I can press Alt or Option, I can start burning in maybe the shadow areas, maybe this area down here because I don't want that to be as visible as the areas that I'm dodging. Maybe dodge out some of this area, or burn, sorry, some of this area back here, and maybe dodge these windows a little bit to make them, I like the angles that these are at. Maybe do some dodging up here in the clouds to make those areas a little bit lighter. And maybe do some burning back here of that bridge. So overall, there's our dodge and burn. It makes a huge difference. Always, 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 always dodge and burn. Always incorporate it in everything you do. So if you watch this whole video and you get nothing else out of this, dodging and burning is key. It's critical. What I'm seeing in this photo, though, is look at the clarity adjustment that I did. It's making our train car here very green and yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mask on this clarity. I'm going to click the clarity layer and press the mask button, and I'm just going to paint with black on that coach car there. Oh, actually, I don't have the right tool selected. So press B for the brush tool and just start brushing with black. If you had your dodge and burn, it happens to me every single time I dodge and burn. Every time I dodge and burn, I end up going to use the brush tool, and I'm dodging and burning on my mask, and it doesn't do anything, and it frustrates me to no end. And yet I've spent 15 plus years in Photoshop, and I still do that every time. But yeah, make sure you have the brush tool selected when you're doing that. So looking at it, if it's too much, by pressing Alt or Option on that mask, you can see it's very black in that area. And maybe I didn't want to work that quick. Instead of deleting that mask and making another mask, you can actually go into the density here. And watch what happens when we change the density of our mask. If you drop the density down, it starts to become more gray. And as it becomes more gray, it lets what's underneath that mask start to come out a little bit more. If we bring it all the way down to 0, we don't have any mask anymore because the density is completely gone. If we bring it up just a little bit, then that effect starts to slowly come in. So I'm actually, instead of going all the way over to the right, because now it doesn't feel like it matches, I'm just going to drop it down just a little bit so that the density on that mask is only about 80%. Now, just so you know, that's going to happen to the entire photograph. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that dodging and burning layer. I'm going to click on my dodge tool, and I'm actually going to dodge out a little bit more of this train car now, because now I've seen that it needs a little bit of dodging to make that a little bit more prominent, because that was an old train car that I believe used to run here at Union Station, and I'd like to accent that and bring that forward a little bit more so that the viewer sees that along with the Union Station. Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. This is our beginning photo. Not that great, but watch as we added the clarity. Then we add the contrast checker. Then we add the dodging and burning. We're starting to bring life to this photograph that didn't already exist. Now, this is something I really wanted to go into a lot deeper during the webinar, but I'm only given about 45 minutes to do those webinars, so I can't go into this much detail with it. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Again, I'm Blake Rudis with Everyday HDR and HDR Insider. You can download this action if you're on the website now. If you're on Everyday HDR right now, it's going to be right above it. There's going to be a download link. You can download the actions package. If you're watching this in YouTube, go in the description at the bottom and just click on the link to download the action package. So, what did we cover here? Just to wrap it all up, we covered making a photograph better with depth. We increase the depth by increasing the contrast to make this photograph better. We lighten things, we darken things, and in the end, we got a better photograph. That's how you make good photographs. It's all about contrast. It's all about depth. If you like this video tutorial, please share it, comment on it, keep the discussion alive. I'd love to hear your thoughts.